So what exactly is the purpose of the daily briefings that we're getting from the White House Coronavirus Task Force? Is it supposed to make us feel better? Is it just a mini Trump rally? Is Dr. Birx actually from Westworld? We're going to talk about all that and more today on the Amateur Hour Political Podcast. Welcome to the Amateur Hour Podcast. I'm John.
I'm Brandon.
And I'm Walt.
Today we're going to talk about some basic news, and then we're going to get into dissecting these new White House Coronavirus Task Force press conferences that we've all been so enamored with. A real quick update on COVID numbers. As of last night, and we're recording this on Wednesday, so this would be Tuesday night's numbers, there were over 52,000 cases of COVID-19 in the United States, with nearly 800 fatalities. This is up about 49,000 cases since last Wednesday. So definitely not 15-0 as we were promised by the president. And today the numbers are continuing to go up. And New York City has been estimated to have about 5% of global cases, which is staggering. All right, so that's the non-inspiring COVID numbers. Let's talk about press conferences, because that's kind of the thing that we want to focus on today. If you are just sort of tuning in politically over the last year or so, as we assume some of our listeners may be, you might have gotten used to the idea that press conferences are not something that actually happen at the White House with any given frequency, any particular frequency. Occasionally, over the last couple of years, someone comes out to the Rose Garden. The president may meet with a foreign dignitary and take some questions, or the president will sort of shout at reporters from under a helicopter rotor in what is probably the worst possible context to answer anyone's questions. But we don't really have press conferences anymore. But we used to have press conferences. And if you were sort of politically cognizant, especially during like the Obama era and stuff like that, and even the beginning of the Trump era, that press conferences used to happen almost every day. And there is actually a White House press corps. And if you watch the Coronavirus Task Force briefings, you know that the press corps is there, and Trump sort of, continually heckles them. And it's gotten smaller and smaller as people have decided not to show up because of the virus. But long ago, in a world far, far away, there used to be a White House press corps who would show up every day, and the White House press secretary would take questions, and it would get a little combative sometimes, as expected. But in general, you could always tune in and watch the press conference. And that was something that I used to like to do. I found it very informative. It was a really quick snippet way to get my news or know what was going to be coming up in the next news cycle. But those things they just totally dropped off. We had Sean Spicer. You guys remember Sean? Spicy Spicer? How long did Sean Spicer last? You remember, Brandon?
Longer than Scaramucci, but I don't know exactly how long he lasted. But
how many Scaramucci's did Spicer last?
I'm sure there's actually an app for that. We'll have to look for it after this. But the interesting thing about the press conference and how it's changed. When it was originally conceived, it was a chance for the media and the White House to have an opportunity to basically communicate the policy. And so every day the press secretary was up there disseminating the decided policy of the White House and translating it to all the different media outlets so that people in the public have access to what the official ideas, the official policy, the trajectory of where the White House wants to take the country is going on a day-to-day basis. As you said, it was combative sometimes. There was moments of tension, right? There's always been administrations that have issues with the way the press is covering things, and or what they're choosing to cover or not cover. There's been some problematic moments in the past when Fox News, I think, was briefly blacklisted from the daily briefing, under the Obama administration. But for the most part, it's a collegial relationship between the press and the White House, designed to communicate official policy. It was done with Joe Lockhart under the Clinton administration. We had people like Dana Perino, Nicole Wallace under the Bush administration. More recently, folks like Josh Earnest. And they're long, they're often boring, and they're full of seemingly inane questions that essentially get to extracting as much information about policy as possible. So this all sort of changed under Trump. And go ahead, John.
Oh no, I was just going to make a joke about how that's just like primetime C-SPAN, but
yes, exactly. Sweeps week for C-SPAN. But you know, this changed under this new administration, and you could see the trajectory over time because you know when Sean Spicer walked in that very first day, he as he was being announced as the press secretary, you could tell he was very excited to carry on this tradition of being the voice of the White House and be able to communicate policy to the press. But then clearly something happened after that first collegial meeting when he came out there and railed against them for the numbers of people that were showing up to the inauguration and made that ridiculous hyperbolic statement of this being the most widely attended inauguration of all time. And you could tell it was not an area that he was very comfortable with. He's been a Washington insider for a long time. He likes to show up at the different events and shake hands and meet people. It was not a job he was very well fit for, to sort of be the mean voice. I don't think he's actually a mean person, and he's not good at being a mean person.
No, not.
But it was a struggle. But then you saw sort of this de-evolution when Sarah Huckabee Sanders came in, who definitely did the work of basically just expressing the anger and the malevolence that the White House had towards the press. And it was really a conversation about contention.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, if you're not aware of her, shall we call it pedigree, she is, Mike Huckabee's daughter. Mike Huckabee has been sort of a pretty vocal mouthpiece for like the Fox News right for quite a while. And so in many ways, it seemed to me like when Sarah Huckabee Sanders took Sean Spicer's place because he was late for his audition for Dancing with the Stars, she sort of not only fit that role as a convenient person to put in there, but she also kind of fit that role because she seemed like she embraced it with a certain amount of gusto that Sean Spicer was never capable of, because Sean Spicer to me never felt like a true believer. Sean Spicer seemed like someone who found himself in a situation that he was pretty uncomfortable with, and he tried pretty hard. And maybe we put Sean Spicer in that same category of people like who at the beginning were trying to push Trump towards his better angels in some way. I don't know if we want to give Spicer the benefit of the doubt in that way, compared to some of the other hellions who have worked for the Trump administration. I would say that I think Spicer is, I dislike him deeply, but probably not at the level that I dislike someone like, say, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. But
well, he's definitely a product of the RNC. I think he and Reince Priebus are very close friends. He was the communications director or the strategy director for the RNC before. He's from that particular pedigree and sort of got absorbed into the Trump camp, versus the folks that are in the administration now are very, very from the court of MAGA, if you will.
He and Reince Priebus were like, in my mind, like they're like the kids who got into smoking cigarettes and then someone gave them heroin, but they didn't like it. It's like they like failed at becoming like gateway addicted or something like that. And then, there's a bunch of other people who are like, oh no, we'll shoot that stuff between our toes. That's fine.
For the record, don't do heroin, everyone. It's very, very bad.
So I've heard. Walt, do you have anything to add to this? What has been your experience as someone who, and not to call you out here, but someone who is a bit younger than Brandon and I? What's been your experience with press conferences? Were you an avid press conference watcher through any of this?
Yeah, I think the Trump press conferences have been really interesting, especially during this coronavirus outbreak. I have been paying attention mostly to how the markets have responded to the press conferences in, minute to minute. So while watching the press conference, you can see what the market is doing in response to whatever Trump and his task force is saying. And it's a really interesting motive from Trump's standpoint, because if you go back all the way probably till when he was trying to get elected, his whole campaign was based on boosting the economy and boosting jobs and stimulating a super prosperous economy. And since he started his re-election campaign, like a year ago, his whole campaign is built around the stock market being at all-time highs. Because whether it be the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, or the small cap Russells, the market in general is the best metric for how the actual economy is doing. And
it's the wins above replacement for economics.
And Mike Trout's winning that somehow too.
Yeah. So Trump's basically, his whole entire campaign, his re-election campaign, was based on the stock market being at all-time highs. He can say that there's the lowest unemployment ever and all these different statistics, but at the end of the day, those statistics are going to fuel the market, whether they're positive or negative. And since the market has started to see some downtrend, he's been under a lot of pressure because now he doesn't really know how to get reelected. He can't say that the stock market's at all-time highs, and in a couple of weeks, he won't be able to say that unemployment's the lowest it's ever been. That metric comes out on Friday, which will be the state unemployment numbers, which will be a very interesting number to see because it might be the first real statistic that we see the impact of the coronavirus. And so during these press conferences, he does his best job to keep the market up and potentially pump the market or cause it to go up. Throughout the last couple of weeks, he's done this in different techniques, whether it be coming up with a kind of a fake story about what he's going to do to save the economy, or coming up with promises that are kind of impossible to accomplish. And I think it was a week and a half ago when he called out the chairman of the Fed, which is Jeremy Powell. That relationship goes back 3 years, really since the president was elected. He has had it out for Jeremy Powell, the chairman of the Fed, because the Fed has been not necessarily behind the rest of the global economy as far as interest rates, but they've been holding rates above zero. And it was around 2% about a year ago. This was basically to keep inflation down and to keep some economic growth held back. Because if you grow an economy too fast, too quick, then the downfall will be a lot harder, which is kind of what we're seeing right now. And so Trump, his goal was to get to 0% interest rates, which will stimulate a lot of growth because capital is free. And Powell would not do this until the coronavirus happened. And it was really interesting to see because during one of the press conferences, Trump really hinted at firing Powell if he didn't lower the rates to zero and start.
Just to be clear, can he actually fire Powell?
Yeah, I think that's a really good debate if he can or cannot. I don't believe he can because the Federal Reserve acts completely independent of the executive branch.
Yeah, so I guess that's one of my questions, because we've seen this resurgence of press conferences over the last, couple of weeks with the coronavirus. Why, Brandon, do you think that we haven't had any press conferences for a year? I mean, can you talk about Stephanie Grisham's tenor? Because I kind of want to think about how Trump has been using them, like Walt said, to sort of try to manipulate the market, kind of juice the market. Like, why wasn't he doing that for the last couple of years? Other than the fact that, the markets were rising, like what is the utility now and all of a sudden starting these things again that they seem to have been so reluctant to do over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think at a certain point, from things that I've read, he basically decided that he was his best messenger. And so anything that was someone else trying to speak for him, he believed did not do the same job of basically doing his work of selling that he does, of hyping up some new thing, postponing a choice around something by saying we'll see what happens, or we'll look into it. There's some triggers and cues we could talk about some point of when he clearly doesn't want to answer the question or doesn't know the answer, and it's sort of it basically translates to I don't know, and I probably won't get back to you. But yeah, I believe Stephanie Gershom used to work as the press secretary for Melania. They had a similar approach with the media where they did not communicate very often. But once she came to work for the White House, the public-facing interaction with the press, at least from the communications office, went to zero. So what we have now is media and Trump shouting at each other before he's getting ready to board a helicopter. It's not very efficient, and it's not a very effective way of communicating. But it's what we have, and then we have what we know from early in this administration is the official word of the president is his Twitter. And so that is what we have to sort of take on and understand the policy of the United States. And man, if you only focus on the Twitter, it's a wild policy.
Well, and that's one of the things that we actually learned when we were having press conferences was that the president's Twitter feed was his official pronouncement to the people of the United States. I think that was was that even maybe going all the way back to Spicer? I don't remember.
It was a couple weeks in.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We're going to take a quick break and talk about a couple of things. And then when we come back, we're going to dig a little bit more into some specific craziness about the press conferences this week, and then talk just a little bit about what our market projections are. So we'll be right back.
Well, we're halfway through our first podcast, and we want to pause for a second just to thank you for listening. If you like what you're hearing, you can head over to knowbetterdobetter.one and sign up for an email update, which will send you a synopsis of the news and markets every morning, Monday through Friday. You'll also be notified about when a new pod is about to drop, and you'll be able to access some exclusive content like vlogs and extended interviews with the interview subjects that we have coming up for the show. I'm sure all of us have our own stories about how coronavirus has affected our ability to work, make money, provide for our families. And one of the hardest hit groups in America right now are independent touring musicians who have literally lost the ability to move freely and to play for gatherings of people, which is how they make their money. The intro and outro music for the pod today was provided by the Mutineers, one of our favorite touring bands from Southern Washington. This is a husband-wife power duo who will rock your ass off, I promise. 100% money back guarantee. So after the pod today, go over to our website at knowbetterdobetter.one and click on the link to the Mutineers website. Check out their music, check out their merch store, buy a record, buy a t-shirt, buy a hoodie. I know you're just sitting on your couch waiting for someone to give you some new music. So there it is, the Mutineers from Southern Washington. All right, back to part 2 of today's pod.
We're back. So let's talk about specifically some things that happened in the press conferences this week, or I guess last week, because we've been having them for a couple of weeks now with the White House Coronavirus Task Force.
My favorite moment of these press conferences so far has been when last week Fauci and Trump got in a little disagreement. Trump was saying that he has a good feeling about a new drug that would have potentially beneficial effects for treatment of the coronavirus. And Fauci said that they're not disagreeing, but Trump has a feeling and he's a scientist. And since that little debate, we haven't seen Fauci, so not sure what happened to Fauci after that.
To be fair, he's just standing behind Trump the whole time, so no one can.
Yeah. I really like Fauci. I thought he was kind of funny and, a little guy, but something happened to him. We don't know where he went.
Well, Trump says he's just busy, right? Like he's working, which is great because it's like, and someone pointed this out on Twitter, like I can't claim responsibility for this nugget of wisdom, but like the president keeps dismissing everyone, as we go, because he wants, he's going to continue to ramble, but he doesn't want, he's like, well, these people have to work, it's like, well, what the fuck are you doing? Like,
yeah,
do not work. Like
what happened to Alex Azar and then the big guy from the CDC? Like they disappeared too. No one's heard from them.
Oh, the CDC guy, I think, was the only one who has practiced social distancing on that stage. Like, he just kept edging away. Maybe he's still edging away, and that's why we haven't seen him. He's still sidestepping. Everybody else is clumping up like they're trying to like actually like infect each other like internally or something.
Yeah, it seems like all the real scientists have disappeared. Like the only one left, what's the lady's name?
Frau Burke.
Dr. Burks.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, Dr. Burks.
I don't know about her. I think she's going to be gone pretty soon too.
Well, okay, so this is interesting, and I wouldn't say this is my favorite moment, but I definitely think it's something worth exploring. Kind of one of the things that we've seen happen over the last couple of weeks is the sort of changing tone from day to day, as it's almost like they're throwing things against the wall and trying to see what sticks, and that might also come back to like not only what sort of resonates with the American people, but also what sort of resonates with the economy or the stock market. But when they started this, I feel like Fauci and Birx were sort of the voices of reason, and they were generally trying to combat Trump's sort of like all pathos approach to this thing, right? They were trying to bring some credibility and some like kind of logical, scientific, medical argument to what was going on, and trying to kind of calm people down while also giving them good advice. And to be fair, I think that, if you're listening to this and you're trying to figure out who to pay attention to Fauci and Birx, right? Like,
absolutely.
I might have some problems with the way in which they've communicated their message, trying to work their way around the sort of monstrosity of the president's ego, but they are still giving good advice. So I think that that's worth saying. But it's been really interesting to see the way in which they've had to kind of counteract him, and then also the way they've had to step back and around him when he gets pissed off about the fact that they're, it's not even contradicting him. They're just giving basic medical advice, and he is, I don't know, giving QAnon medical advice or whatever, so, but it's interesting to see the way the messaging kind of changes. And even, Birx, in what I thought was actually kind of a disappointing turn yesterday, or maybe the day before, all of a sudden she went back to this, it's really only dangerous for people who have 3 or more pre-existing medical conditions, who are over the age of 80 and stuff like that. Whereas 2 days before, she had been talking about how, young people were getting this, and young people were ending up in the hospital, and how it's showing that young people have comorbidities that they're not aware of because young people aren't going to the doctor, and they're unaware of their own, health situation, which again isn't meant to panic anyone, but it is a good point. And I thought that was great that she was talking about that. And then all of a sudden, obviously the president must have gotten angry, because now she's back to sort of the party line, and it's really, dangerous, but let's not overreact. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that kind of stuff? Any other examples of like weird pivots that have happened?
Well, I mean, I think the most disconcerting pivot for me earlier this week was, last week was pretty focused on getting people to follow these guidelines and to practice social distancing, stay inside. We'll deal with the economy as it comes. But then this week, you started to see a message that was vocalized by the president at one point, and then became, you could see, a sort of talking point on different areas of the media. This idea, the cure can't be as bad as the disease, or as deadly as the disease. So what they're doing is trying to prime the pump to basically reopen the markets and get people out into the world and participating. And you saw different extremities of the response to this message. One, you saw someone like the lieutenant governor of Texas go on I think Tucker Carlson's show, and basically say old people should take one for the team and get sick and die for the future generations of the economy. I'm paraphrasing, just like Adam Schiff. I don't want to be guilty of getting in trouble for paraphrasing, but that was effectively what the ask was, which is shocking and just an insane thing to say. But even Larry Kudlow has been saying the same thing, and they're clearly spooked about the long-term health of the market, which I get. But it's a little early to be saying maybe we should just let a couple million people die and then move on, as opposed to finding a way to really deal with this. The other thing that's I think is interesting about the message itself is I think the choice to use the term cure is very specific, because there is not a cure. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have a cure for this right now. We don't have any miracle drugs that have solved for for the health issues here, but they're using cure as associated with these practices of social distancing, of shutting down businesses, to try and sort of inject that language into what's going on here, which does two things. It puts the focus back on what's the trade-offs around the markets, and it also takes the focus away from the fact that they don't actually have a cure. They haven't been able to effectively get to something there, or the fact that there's not enough testing kits or people, there's not enough people being tested to actually know how to effectively manage this.
Yeah, and I think, just from a rhetorical perspective, that's a really interesting choice, because one other phrase that we've heard a lot over the last day has been light at the end of the tunnel. Like, I've been seeing that from a lot of, people who are trying to kind of bolster that message from the president. And if there is a cure, then there is light at the end of the tunnel, technically. So the more times you say cure, the more people see like that end point, right? And so, but neither of those things exist. I mean, there is an end point, obviously, because there's kind of an end point to everything. But the idea that if you just say it enough, which is very like, how do you say, Goebbelian or something? I mean, it's sort of, propaganda 101, that if you just say something long enough and loud enough, people will begin to interpret it the way that you want them to, and they will begin to incorporate it into their own lexicon. And then it becomes language, and language becomes structure. And then all of a sudden, structurally we have a cure, and
right.
Then did it, right? Yay, he did it. And now we can all go back to normal because we all talked about it long enough for it to become a reality. Yeah. Which is, just how propaganda works.
I've started to notice a weird anomaly that could be considered potentially a cure, which is in Germany. And, they had a significant rise in cases, and I think they're number 4 now in the world for number of cases. But from the beginning, Merkel said that they are going to divert all resources to the healthcare system, and that, there is a chance that a lot of people will get this, but our goal now is to prevent people from dying. And our economy will suffer, but that's our first goal, is to stop people from dying. Their death rate is the lowest in the world by a significant amount. I think they're down at 0.1%. Italy is at 10%. Yeah, Germany and Italy are right next to each other. But for some reason, Germany is doing something right.
Well, yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, like this whole argument that, that sacrifice, this kind of goes back to something that Trump said early on, like when he was making an argument for why we needed to surge troops to Afghanistan or something like that. I don't remember what the context was, but, he said, he quoted Christ and said, no greater love hath a man, than this, that he lay his life down for his friend, or something, like literally using it as like a recruitment tool, that if, Jesus were, here today, he would encourage you to join the Marine Corps or something like that, and, throw yourself on a grenade or whatever. Like, just, it is kind of the same idea that, like, sacrifice. Americans are about sacrificing, and that means now that you sacrifice for Trump and his economy with your life in the same way that, you put yourself in the gap at Normandy or something like that. You know what I mean? Just like,
I think that was his whole point yesterday on the Fox press briefing, which was around Easter. And he said it was all, he was going to get to that goal for religious purposes, whether that be people gathering or his calling from, Jesus, that he needs to have this cured by Easter. That was his motivation. It wasn't any scientific backing behind that.
Yeah, Trump, he did this thing where he was like, oh, I love Easter, like such a special day. Like, why does Trump love Easter? I think it's the Cadbury eggs, personally. I mean, that's got to be it. Yeah. But then the Fox News pundit, he actually like did the president a solid, and he was like something, and I'm paraphrasing here again, like, but it was something along the lines of after Trump had said that it was going to happen by Easter, he was like, resurrection of sorts or whatever, and it was like the circle was completed. We had this sort of, the economy, the tomb is empty and the economy has gone forth, and then,
the economy has risen, the GDP has risen.
Like doubting Thomas Americans can stick their fingers in the fucking, GDP hole and feel for themselves that it truly lives or something,
Do you think Trump had all those questions prior to the Fox interview?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that the questioners were definitely selected. The best part was when Harris Faulkner's background kept changing, like running through all the different Fox News backgrounds, and then it just went dark. And then she asked the president a question, but they hadn't given him an earpiece, so he couldn't hear her. I mean, seriously, like, how bad do you have to be at your job to get an interview with the president of the United States and forget to give him a way to hear you? I mean, I know we're dealing with like a pandemic, but that is just fucking unacceptable.
I'm gonna mitigate our critiques of technical problem solving for broadcasting until we have a completely pristine podcast on our hands too. But
true, they could have Zoomed, Brandon.
Zoom is not an official sponsor, but if you'd like to sponsor, we will accept your money.
Should I have bought Zoom stock? So, all right, maybe that's a good way to kind of transition into Walt. Why don't you tell us whether you think, from a market perspective, that the president has actually done a good job of juicing the market with these press conferences? Like, has it been negligible?
It's been pretty interesting. I think it's gone both ways for him. In some cases, it's been really ugly. In some cases, it's been really good. And, if you go look at the most active days in the stock market, whether it be the highest point gain, highest percentage gain, biggest drop, it's all covered by Trump now. He has created the most volatile stock market ever. So we have, trillions of dollars moving around in the markets right now every day, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing, right? It's unpredictable, to say the least. So, a single word, he says, can determine the outcome of the market, and that can be, up to $1 trillion lost or gained in a day. Last week he had a press conference where he mentioned the word recession, and this was, read into a lot. And I think the market dropped 11% that day. One of the biggest drops in history. It sat up there, I think, right above the Great Depression. And the only bigger drop was in 1987. A really good metric of volatility is the volatility index, or the VIX. And the VIX is representative of Wall Street's fear gauge. So how fearful is Wall Street? Typically, you see the stock market falling, the VIX going up, more fear around the street. And the VIX has been setting all-time highs. It was last week. Now it's fallen a little bit. It might appear as though the market has bounced based on the $2 trillion aid bill. I think the market will be hesitant until they see the fine print of what that deal actually is. But Trump would like to say that he has been successful in keeping the markets up.
I was going to ask you about that bill. I believe there's some stipulations in there that buybacks aren't allowed within this bill. There's quite a bit of oversight. How does the market respond to stimulus with constraints versus just, here is some money and you do with it as you see fit?
Yeah, and that goes into a much bigger point. What happened in 2008 and 2007 is there was a lot of financial institutions that were out of control, and they were practicing unethical techniques. And what came out of that was a lot of reform around the finances in the United States. Some of those reforms were really beneficial. Some of them might have been a little too tight. But the Trump administration has basically rolled back a lot of those restrictions. And buybacks were never in a restriction like that. But in general, during the Trump administration, because of the tax cuts, we've seen a lot of buybacks. So this has diluted their earnings per share, which has caused the stocks to go up. The market will be really hesitant until they see the fine print of this bill because the potential restraints. Right out of the gate, we saw that none of this none of this capital can go to Trump companies. That's a really specific restraint. And I think it's a good restraint. But if that's in there, there's kind of no saying what else could be in there. And until that is really disclosed, I think the market will be capped.
It's just an Elizabeth Warren provision where everyone gets a sweater vest and a silver Prius.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll take a sweater vest if I get a silver Prius out of it.
How about a sweater vest with a silver Prius on it?
I think.
Can I wear that while driving the silver Prius?
Yeah, dude. It's what is that called? Synchronicity? I don't know.
I think even was it yesterday or a day before, Trump mentioned something about companies giving shares to American people. I'm interested to see where that goes, because how that works out, I have no idea. I could see that, maybe companies are forced to give citizens treasury stock that they own, and then they just give it out. I don't really know, but no one picked up on that. But in one of the interviews, he mentioned that companies are going to give shares to Americans, which I don't know what that means. We'll have to find out.
That is really weird. Maybe it's just that's what Boeing's doing. Is it's like last hurrah. It's just giving everybody Boeing stock. All right, we only have a couple minutes left here, so let's close out with just maybe a little bit about what the market might do over the end of this week or whatever, to the extent that you can talk about that, Walt.
Yeah, it seems like the market has found a little bottom and it might be bouncing. We've seen a lot of that volatility calm down, and it seems like there's been an overall stabilization. And, with the Fed, they came out with kind of unlimited quantitative easing, which means they're going to be out there. They're going to be the biggest buyer. They're going to be buying up stuff, whether it be, assets in the equity market, or we don't really know what it's going to be. We won't really find that out until they disclose their balance sheet at the end of the quarter. And then, we got zero interest rates, so that's always a stimulant. I thought it was really interesting the other day, gold and silver, so the precious metals were going up a lot, and I saw a lot of money moving out of equity into precious metals. So that's interesting, because that would push the dollar down in valuation, which, would help American companies in a lot of ways, because then we can do global commerce a lot easier. But really, there's no saying where the markets will go, because, no one knows what Trump's going to say in his next press briefing.
That gives me to one last idea that I want to float out here before we close this out, which is, we talked about how the market hates volatility. There's one constant of volatility in the market, and that is the president. I had an idea a couple of years ago that they should basically create a biodome bubble where they put a fake White House in there and cast it with a whole bunch of actual people, wire it with internet, and a fake amount of bots to respond with praise to tweets, hire a fake press corps that only lavishes praise, and maybe do a carbon copied version of Fox News straight in there and call it the Trumpman show. And he just is able to govern within a bubble that has no effect on the actual market.
There it is. We solved all the world's problems. We'll see you next week. Take it easy, guys.
Pessimists and shit out yellow bricks. Overconfident and so damn insecure. We've been chasing after monsters, though we're running at the core. Overconfident, superficial. Overconfident, superficial. We've got damn impressive teeth. God has enough respected by the world. Got a job for that. You got retirement, investment in security. Got a change political position.